The National History Center, in turn an initiative of the American Historical Association and the Woodrow Wilson Center to explore new important historical findings and works, perspectives on international and national affairs. Today we have a very special treat for you. With the Wilson Center's very own current fellow, Devin Fergus. Let me, before I introduce him briefly, thank both my co-chair, Roger Lewis, our co-conspirator here at the Wilson Center, Dr. Sonia Michel, and Tim McDonald and Miriam Cunningham from the Wilson Center and the National History Center, respectively, who really help put these events and meetings together in the fine setup that we have here today. Next week, Monday, April 12th, we have Elliot Cohen from Johns Hopkins University talking about Supreme Command and Wartime Leadership. Very intriguing title, and we look forward to that. However, today it's on to Jim Crow and Devin Fergus, who, as I mentioned, is currently a Wilson Center Fellow, one of our distinguished fellows, on loan from Vanderbilt University, where he is Assistant Professor of Modern United States and African American History. He is an expert on 20th century U.S. political history, U.S. social policy, and African American history. Dr. Fergus published extensively on the issues of politics, identity, and inequality in recent American history. His first book, Liberalism, Black Power, and the Making of American Politics, 1965 to 1980, published by the University of Georgia Press last year, explores the interplay between liberalism and black nationalism in those years, and why the reasons why those very policies of liberalism that moderated black power also energized the new right. This book won the Choice Outstanding Book Award from the American Library Association. He's currently working here on a project entitled, tentatively, Land of the Fee, The Decline of the Middle Class and the Making of the New World Financial Order. It's a great pleasure to give Devin the floor, but not without, I know you've all come to expect, a very special introduction to the subject by my co-chair, Roger Lewis. Roger.
I'm not quite sure what to make of that, Christian, but I did want to say that I am afraid that I'm responsible for the phrase used in the title of the lecture, The Echoes of Jim Crow. This was because Devin suggested this in the material that he gave us, and I said, this is a great theme, and we should discuss it, at least. And Devin's a very good sport because he said, okay. I also want to point out that we have as part of the audience this morning Professor Jürgen Koka from the University of Berlin, and the reason that I am mentioning him is that he taught at the small black college Tougaloo in Mississippi in the 1960s. So at the beginning of the discussion, I will ask him to say perhaps just a word about Jim Crow then and Jim Crow now, perhaps. We also have Carolyn Brown, the director of the Kluge Center, with us this afternoon. I will probably turn to her also for a first question. Carolyn, could you bring your chair up to the table just so we'll have you as part of the group?
Very good.
Devin Fergus.
Thank you all for coming on such a beautiful day, and what I believe is the opening day of the Washington Nationals season. And I hear they're undefeated. So, seriously, thank you all for coming. I also want to make sort of a minor sort of comment too, or mention that in 2011 I'll be joining the faculty at Hunter College, history faculty at Hunter College in City University of New York, and next year I'll be at Emory on fellowship. But getting to the heart of my talk, I'd like to provide an overview, a quick overview of my talk today. Briefly, I'll summarize the book, I'll talk about the project's origins and the main questions that I'm trying to grapple with or address in my research, the state of the field, and what I believe is in part my scholarly contribution in the ways in which I think historians, again, most of us are historians here, might provide a sort of unique perspective and insights into current discussions about deregulation and current conversations about inequality. And then last, I'll shift to an overview of the book's argument, looking at the first three parts of the book, which looks at three spheres of consumer finance fees, first at home, then at school, then at work, and the fourth sphere, which will basically be the bulk of the talk about transportation. So first home, school, work, transportation. And then I'll close with in part an overture of why this, again, has echoes of the Cold War year and Jim Crow in terms of offering an international narrative about American democracy and American capitalism.
Let me just make sure that your microphone is working.
Is that better?
Right.
Okay. Okay. I'll do my best. Thanks. Okay. As Christian said, my book is tentatively titled The Land of the Fee, and the book examines the rise of consumer finance fees amid an era of deregulation in four spheres of modern American life: home, education, transportation, and work. Now, these four areas of consumer finance, capture the episodic and everyday expenses that serve as drivers of wealth inequality. And when I say episodic, I'm talking about the 30-year mortgage, 15-year mortgage. And I'm also talking about in terms of the 18-year-old, the 17-year-old who goes and takes out a federal student loan. These episodic consumer investments. By everyday expenses, I'm making reference here to the daily accrual of interest on a payday loan. As one advertisement says of payday lenders, the interest accrues daily, so you will pay only the interest for the amount of time you need it. Again, so the episodic and everyday interests in consumer finance fees that in part play a role in driving the wealth gap. The aggregate burden of these fees is a key yet heretofore overlooked driver of the widening wealth disparity between the top and bottom fifths of U.S. households over the last 4 decades. First, I'd like to begin by sharing a story with you about this couple named the Connors, Leland and Sherry Connor. Now, the Connors were a young couple from San Bernardino, California. Now, the Connors put their joint income together to purchase their first home. Now, listening to their real estate broker, suggesting the real estate broker, the balance of their financing came largely from a first mortgage, which they took out at 8.75%, and a second mortgage trust with a one-year balloon loan at 11%. And the Connors were a young couple and in good health with no children, and they believed that they could save and be thrifty and manage their mortgage and work out a better debt-to-income ratio in the years to come. And the Connors real estate broker also assured them that they could refinance that second trust, that balloon payment, with only, quote, a small increase in monthly payments. However, in a little over a year, the Connors found their payments jump over 60%. And in an effort to meet their new monthly payments, they let all of the bills go. Sometimes when I give this talk, I ask someone to turn off the lights, right? They let all of the bills go. The water bill, the heat, utilities, light bill. And they let all the bills go before they finally gave up trying to make their payments. They made 3 balloon payments before they finally gave up. So the Connors then decided to put their house on the market, but they had no takers. Bankruptcy was not an option for the Connors. Why? Because Mr. Connor was a bonded armored car employee and would possibly be fired if he filed for bankruptcy. And so within 30 months, the house was foreclosed, and the Connors found themselves living back in rented quarters, but some $33,000 poorer. Now, stories like the Connors were not uncommon in California. Foreclosure sales in the state had jumped 173% during the first 6 months of the year compared to the same time a year previous. And the state's troubled economy exposed the potential shortcomings of creative financing in the mortgage industry, which exacerbated the foreclosure problem. But here's the rub. This was not 2007 or 2009 or this year. This was 1982. The Connors and cautionary tales like theirs, and there are other stories like theirs, appeared in national newspapers across national newspapers. And such stories in California, America's largest mortgage market, should have set off alarms to policymakers. Yet it didn't. At the same time, the Connors were going through their financial difficulties and troubles. Congress was debating a new deregulation bill for mortgages. And instead, they created the financing, created creative financing, and created it nationally and codified it nationally in new deregulatory legislation. Now, open with the mortgage issue because it's a familiar story, it's a familiar subject. But mortgages form simply one part of a larger story about the rise of consumer finance fees in the four spheres that are really indispensable in modern American life: the home, school or education, work or job, and fourth, transportation. Again, transportation connects one's home to one's work or one's school. This project sort of originates out of a series of questions, 5 basically. First, how following years of record home ownership, typically the most reliable builder of wealth in a free market society, why following these years of record home ownership has disparity only increased, has wealth disparity only increased? Second, why despite closing income gaps between minorities and whites and women and men over the last quarter century, have racial and gender wealth trends widened between these same groups in the U.S. over the same period of time? Third, how has opposition to gender and civil rights equity laws contributed to indebting the children of America's middle class? And fourth, in what ways does this tell us about the free market system and individual meritocracy? And might the free market be eroding individual meritocracy in America, that most cherished of Western values? And finally, in the zero-sum world we now live, what impact does this all have in America's efforts to win over the hearts and minds of people abroad, especially among practitioners of Sharia law, which regard usury among, quote, the grand sins? Now, with these questions in mind, my project explores the historical reasons for the sharp increase in economic inequality in the United States beginning in the late 1970s, what policymakers have done to aggravate and remedy this disparity, and what ultimately is proven to be its current impact, possibly long-term impact. And I do so by focusing on a generation of policies that have silently eroded consumer protections while simultaneously advancing fringe financial services, particularly the areas of payday lending, federal financial aid system, auto insurance, as well as the subprime mortgage and home equity loans. Now, the erosion of consumer protections and the concomitant rise of these fringe financial services are inextricably linked to deregulation. An environment of financial deregulation in recent decades has not only helped to erode consumer protections and create an operational space for the advancement of fringe financial services, but it has also perhaps imperiled American democracy itself, again, undermining perhaps U.S. efforts abroad to win over the hearts and minds of others. Now, as for how I see my work related to the state of the field and how might scholars, historians in particular, contribute to the current discussions about deregulation and economic inequality. Now, my research seeks to bridge the divide between humanists and social scientists in making sense of the historical contingencies that may inform today's wealth gaps. And by historical contingencies, I mean that individuals have agency and the choices that individuals and institutions make matter. And so, the historical agencies that may inform today's wealth gap. Historians in particular bring unique methodological tools to today's problems. And one of these unique tools I think historians are quite adept and ready to bringing is the tool of exploring and explaining original intent and its impact, potential impact. After all, original intent is the first metric to begin measuring the success or perhaps failure of any social policy. For example, when President Carter signed the nation's first modern financial deregulation law, a law that created the subprime housing market, What did his advisors understand to be the law's, quote, most significant feature? And why was his companion bill, passed 2 years later, labeled, quote, an aid bill, a bailout effect for mortgage lenders? And the ability to provide a historical perspective is in large part because my research stands on the shoulders of earlier interventions of sociologists like Dalton Conley and Michael Young, whose works have been critical in understanding the nexus between investment and consumption, as well as political scientists like Jacob Hacker, who raises fundamental questions about the ways in which institutions both erode and erect ideas of Jacob Hacker on the death of accountability and the shift of risk and responsibility to individuals from institutions. And I say thirdly, from behavioral economists and finance scholars like a Robert Franks and a Robert Schiller and a Stephen Meyer, who ask important questions about things like present bias preference and the ways in which effective choices often shape social policy. And again, that really ties in with notions of historical contingency. Now, my work also seeks to layer the interpretive insights of urban policy scholars. And here, Roger, I'll try to bring in the Jim Crow question. Because in the aftermath of Jim Crow, also known as the post-civil rights years, urban policy scholars have written quite extensively about the unintended consequences of the out-migration of the black middle class and their role models, the black middle class and role models. Again, that experience and impact on the lived experiences of inner-city peoples and urban Americans. But perhaps the time has come to revise the urban underclass narrative, especially given what we've witnessed in the last 10 to 12 years. For the most stable elements of urban neighborhoods have all migrated out in this sort of post-Jim Crow or post-civil rights decades period. What then explains the near-epidemic spread of mortgage and home equity lenders throughout America's inner cities, detailed anecdotally in Robert Bittner's book, Confessions of a Subprime Lender. And for those who are a bit more quantitatively inclined, I suggest you turn to the Federal Reserve and HUD reports and studies, which show that often the most stable middle and lower income neighborhoods and long-time homeowners are the ones who find themselves the main targets of subprime lenders. Why? Because equity lenders want people who have equity, who have built up equity in their houses and their homes. So again, these are people who are achievers of the American dream, equity-rich, urban-dwelling minority homeowners who have lived in the house for decades. This is why lenders initially go to the local register of deeds, searching out those who have either paid off their mortgage or are close to paying off their mortgage, and trying to target those individuals for high-cost equity loans. Thus, in a historical irony, today's most vulnerable victims of high-cost lending are frequently the original victims of past redlining, America's elderly blacks. As black homeowners who have resided in inner ring cities for decades, they have had a great opportunity to build home equity, and the lender's desire to tap this accumulated wealth puts elderly blacks at the greatest risk. This is in part my reasons why AARP in Indiana was so interested in doing studies and reports about predatory lending in states like Indiana. And my research seeks to build on this rich body of foundational interdisciplinary literature. Now, the project itself, the book itself, Land of the Free, explores, as I said, 4 spheres of contemporary consumer life during the golden age of deregulation, which is basically financial deregulation, I'm talking specifically, circa 1980 to 2007, during that period of time. The first sphere I examine is the home. America's gateway law to financial deregulation started with housing and the law known as DIDMA, or the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act. Passed in 1980, DIDMA effectively abolished state usury caps and mortgages, lifting the amount of interest banks had charged on primary mortgages since the 1930s. Now, Dittman was among the first in a series of step cases and congressional decisions that reduced regulatory oversight of the financial services industry. But how did the Carter administration and his Treasury Secretary, G. William Miller, explain the value and importance of Dittman? What do you say was the most significant feature of Dittman to the American consumer? Well, the original intent, according to these policymakers, was that Dittman would help boost the savings of the average consumer and account holder, which in September 1979 hovered roughly around 7.9%, its lowest rate in 30 years. Comparatively speaking, in the 21st century, the savings rates of the average American is roughly range between negative savings rate and 3.9%. Again, so this was the original intent of the first financial deregulation law, to boost the savings of the average account holder for the American. It raises basic questions. Again, this is according to the Carter administration. Now, in the aftermath of Dittman's passage, the financial services industry introduced a raft of new exotic mortgages, laying the foundation for a generation of creative lending instruments and abuses, as the Connors and others found out, such as adjustable rate mortgages and balloon payments. Now to the second sphere, school or education. If a home purchase is the most expensive financial investment one can make, then the argument typically goes a college degree is now the second most significant investment. Here too we see the impact of deregulation in the massive rise of student loan debt. In 2008, the latest statistics I have, the average debt for graduating college seniors with a student loan, and that's approximately 2/3 of college seniors, actually had student loan debt. The average debt was over $23,000. Now, this trend towards student indebtedness started approximately a generation ago, and it serves in part as a textbook example of the laws of unintended consequences of some social policies. Now, in the early 1980s, the federal government expressed a principal concern to decentralize authority. This core principle was manifest in higher education in reducing the federal government's role in student financing, and at least reducing requirements of burdensome compliance requirements like Title IX. Right? And Title IX is a law that states that no person shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, colleges and universities were required to comply with Title IX if they accepted grant money from the federal government, but it was less clear if that compliance was necessary if the money was indirect or even direct loan money. And so the DOJ, Department of Justice, contended that unlike Pell Grants, quote, guaranteed student loans do not constitute federal financial assistance and thus do not trigger the regulatory scrutiny of Title IX. I mean, the logic was simple. Shifting to student loans for grants would help greatly reduce, if not eliminate altogether, the need to comply with burdensome regulatory policies like Title IX. We can also throw the Civil Rights Act under that in education as well. Now, there were dissenting voices. One of them was actually Elizabeth Dole, who was a White House Special Assistant and chair of the Presidential Task Force on Equal Rights for Women. And Elizabeth Dole not only raised questions about the impact this shift away from Pell Grants to loans would have on women, but also on African Americans as well, who, in Dole's words, used the federal grant, the Pell Grant, to quote, as quote, one of the primary vehicles for upward mobility. Now, Dole's admonition appeared to fall on deaf ears. Why? In the immediate months and years that followed, student aid recipients were redirected to loans away from grants. The decision to rewrite aid eligibility guidelines had dramatic and immediate consequences. The years immediately following guideline changes, from 1980 to 1985, freshman participation in the Pell Grant program declined by nearly 1/2. By contrast, freshman participation in the Guaranteed Student Loan Program increased by almost 1/4. Changing eligibility rules eliminated more than 250,000 freshmen from Pell Grants between 1980 and 1986. And over the next 3 decades, high-cost private student loans would increasingly come to fill the void left by a hemorrhaging federal subsidized loan and grants program. In the 1970s, for example, grants covered 70% of college costs. By 2008, grants covered merely one-third. And the demise of Pell Grants and the rise of high-cost student loans and is an example of how legitimate concerns about ostensibly unfair civil rights and gender rules may have had an unintended consequence of potentially contributing to the indebtedness of the American middle class. Again, the average graduating senior is $23,000 in debt. Of those who take out student loans, the two-thirds take out student loans. Now, like many other consumer expenses, the cost of higher education, that is the cost of tuition, for post-secondary learning of all kinds, outpaced average family income in the 1990s. Now, as most of us know, highlighting the income gap is critical to explain economic inequality in recent decades. The median wage, adjusted for inflation, has languished since the 1970s, and moreover, since 2000, median wages have actually declined. And Americans have cloaked the wage stagnation in three main ways, as you guys I'm sure well know. First, through the two-earner household. Both parents are now working in the household. Secondly, working more hours. Right, the average American now works 350 more hours per year than their European counterparts. And third, by using the home as a piggy bank, the equity lending, refinancing to pay debts, etc. And this leads me really to the third sphere of my project, and that's payday lending. Now, perhaps the most ubiquitous private sector response to the loss of the real wage has been the growth of the shadow banking system. And consumers are most familiar with the shadow banking system through the payday loan stores, as a growing number of middle-class Americans now find themselves deep in debt, have turned to these short-term loan stores in an effort to make up the difference between family income and household expenses. Now, nothing underscores how payday lending is a staple in the domain of American life than the fact that payday loan stores now outnumber the two monuments of modern-day American middle-class consumption, which would be Starbucks and McDonald's. There are more payday loan stores now than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. Unless you know how, again, these stores and wage stagnation is sort of infiltrated to the middle class. And a couple of brief examples. Let's go to Minnesota, for example, where since 1999, 1.1 million payday loans have been taken out. And the majority of the loans are taken out in suburban communities. In fact, there are 3 times more payday loans taken out in suburban Minnesota than in the Twin Cities. Also, one could turn to popular online payday loan sites, where a study of over 240,000 visitors showed that about one-third of the visitors earn incomes of $60,000 or more. In Virginia, when one mega payday loan lender was asked why their stores are all located and catered to suburban neighborhoods, the spokesperson openly acknowledged it's the mainstream middle class who need our support. Our customers are just hardworking, good middle class people. And in these financial toxins that I've discussed, these sort of 3 financial toxins I've discussed, include more than simply the infamous subprime mortgages and privatized student aid and payday loans. They also include seemingly anodyne products, which have filtered their way into the mainstream of the financial system. A clear example of this is auto insurance premiums. And now we can, in part, talk about that people take out payday loans because they have not managed to budget their money properly, or people overextend themselves with credit cards because, again, they've not budgeted properly or fairly. But that argument is sort of difficult to sustain with the financial service known as auto insurance premiums, in which the premium is not based on whether the driver is deserving, but is based in part on where one lives. So it's not the deserving good driver who often winds up paying more. I mean, it's the deserving good driver who often winds up paying more, subsidizing the bad driver. So in the few minutes I have remaining, let me turn to the final sphere in in my case study here, which is in auto insurance. Now, second to one's home, there is no more durable good and necessity for the typical consumer than a car. In every car, just like I hear almost every person pretty soon, by law needs to be insured. Thus, relatively speaking, in the world of financial services, lenders should hardly be considered the most protected and promoted class. That privileged perch should likely be reserved for auto insurers who occupy a unique protected status within the U.S. economy, a mandatory good and service required by law to purchase, yet provided exclusively by the private sector on a for-profit basis. Now, such public-private collusion resulted in skyrocketing premiums for insured motorists by the mid-1980s. Now, this issue of auto insurance amplifies several key themes of my research. First, it illustrates the ways in which consumer finance services have been extended to traditionally underserved populations but in high-cost terms. Second, through something called the territorial rating system. And the territorial rating system is the use of location, primarily zip codes, as the primary factor determining auto insurance pricing. So through this territorial rating system, auto insurance captures how fees and charges have, if unwittingly, been transferred. And third, in the perpetuation of the territorial rating system, despite popular opposition, voter opposition to it, the story is another textbook example of what behavior finance experts and economists often refer to as the effective decision-making of present bias preferences. And by present bias preferences here, in this particular instance, I'll talk about voters say they wanted a merit-based society. That's the long-term objective and aim. But the present bias preference, at least this is what insurers anticipated, was that voters would trade the long-run plans of more merit-based society in exchange for the instant benefits of reduced premium cuts. Fourth, the primacy of the territorial rating system raises fundamental questions about whether the free market system is actually, if unattendedly, eroding notions of individual meritocracy in America. Because, again, insurance is not predicated on the motorist's individual merit. The merit of an individual driver, your driving record, but it's predicated on other factors, social factors, environmental factors, identity factors. Finally, this case study illustrates why the past might be helpful in informing the president, and the present, actually. For both President Barack Obama and his conservative critics, people like George Will, auto insurance is the current apotheosis for modeling health insurance reform, which the President of the United States has called key to reform to turn the economy around. Yet, as I show in my project, Lender the Fee, holding up auto insurance as a triumph for consumers is a deeply troubling rewriting of history that requires forgetting 3 decades of nullifying state consumer protection law since the 1980s. So let me dive into the case study of auto insurance of Proposition 103 and take us back to the eve of the post-Cold War era in 1988, when America and Americans found themselves embroiled in a national identity crisis, which we would later call the Culture Wars. Now, that year, Colorado, Arizona, and Florida placed on their ballots immigration and English-only initiatives. In Michigan and in Arkansas, the culture wars took the form of abortion, in which dominated election conversation. In South Dakota, voters went to the polls to decide whether to legalize gambling. And in next door Maryland, the issue was gun control and whether there should be a ban on cheap handguns. Yet, of all the hot-button ballot issues which have dominated domestic discourse since the late 1980s, none was more hotly contested and more costly than what national TV networks called at the time the insurance wars. Nationally, what made the 1988 insurance wars the most contested issue in California and the costliest non-presidential campaign in U.S. history up to that point. Again, more money was spent in this election, on this proposition, than either presidential candidate, George Bush or Michael Dukakis, spent in the general campaign that year. Again. And the great concern was not necessarily simply the fear of uncoupling postal codes from rate pricing. It was also the fear of the election's ripple effect, that this, what happens in California, will happen in the nation. They all saw California is where history happens first. Now, at stake was one of the most sizable distributions of financial resources of the last 3 decades. The reality was that millions of urban motorists in California, because they lived in low-income and working-class neighborhoods, each year paid higher premiums to insurers than non-urban motorists with the same driving record. Collecting revenues from urban drivers, auto insurers like California's largest State Farm, then in turn effectively passed these savings on in the form of lower rates to suburban and exurban drivers. And what largely made this premium subsidy possible was insurers' ongoing emphasis on postal codes in calculating premiums rather than the driving record of the insured. In California alone, aiding this postal code tax, this PC tax, postal code tax, a PC tax, in auto insurance would have in 2006 meant an estimated $204 million in the pockets of the state's urban motorists. This translates into approximately $400 per driver each year for the urban motorists. And if you want to extrapolate this out, the subsidy would total about $20,000 for the average driving span of a motorist, 50-year driving span. If you extrapolate out, $20,000 lifespan of a motorist. Now, the issue of auto insurance came to the fore in 1988 with Proposition 103. And Proposition 103 was designed to address skyrocketing rates. Since 1986, Californians had watched their auto insurance rates go up by 58%. In an effort to stave off escalating insurance costs, consumer activists launched Proposition 103. And Prop 103's main provisions stipulated the following. A rate cut for policyholders. Second, an independent regulatory agency to oversee the industry. Third, an elected insurance commissioner. Now, there were a series of ballots, and there are a couple of ballots, competing initiatives, I should say, on the ballot that year. But what distinguished 103 from the others? And they all talked about rate cuts and having an elected insurance commissioner, but what distinguished 103 from the other, and what struck fear in the heart of insurers was the stipulation that insurance be based primarily on one's driving record, not territorial factors. And why was this Prop 103 again most popular, and this particular stipulation most popular? Well, voters overwhelmingly favored the repeal of the territorial rating system imposed leading up to the election. And Prop 103 passed. So who voted for Prop 103? As you might well imagine, urban and inner city motorists in places like Los Angeles and San Diego and San Francisco supported intensely. But the crucial swing vote for Prop 103 actually came from suburbia, suburban white couples, often with married children. And they supported Prop 103 for 2 main reasons. One, a matter of self-interest. Right? Prop 103, like the other propositions, guaranteed or promised they would have the rates of the insured cut. Right? So they believed that back in 103 would result in having their own insurance rates cut. Secondly, was a broader social value that Prop 103 imagined and envisioned and expressed. A merit-based system that appealed to the sense of fairness of the suburban couple, the suburban voter. Again, both urban and suburban motorists stood to benefit from the rate cuts. And in this way, the promise of Prop 103 stemmed from its unifying consumer appeal. This is a progressive moment, in part imagined, one could sort of argue or say. And Prop 103 galvanized the average California consumer in ways past propositions, which often pitted whites in suburbia against racial minorities in inner cities, had failed to do. The populist-minded groups like the Foundation for Taxpayers and Consumer Rights joined collectively with groups like civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, joined forces to back 103. Now, nationally, the competing reactions of Wall Street and Main Street captured the clash of interests distinguishing the financial services industry from consumers. What do I mean? After 103's passage, Wall Street markets reacted with a stock sell-off of publicly traded auto insurance companies. Meanwhile, in the afterglow of the 103 victory, consumer groups from 30 states contacted Prop 103 organizers, asking how to launch their own consumer revolt in their respective states. And within 24 hours, the auto insurance industry responded. The day after the election, the nation's sixth and ninth largest insurers announced they would stop writing insurance and pull out of California altogether. In the weeks following the election, one-third of the largest insurers had rejected all new applications in California. Now, if non-compliance characterized insurers' initial reaction to Proposition 103, it was this thing called regulatory capture, which defined the long-term strategy employed by insurers. Now, the aim of regulatory capture, in a nutshell, is this: is to align the interests of the regulators with the interests of the industry, as opposed to align the interests of the regulators with the interests of consumers. So how did insurers go about doing this? Well, insurers went about trying to align the interests of California regulators by bankrolling the campaign of the state's first elected insurance commissioner, a man by the name of Charles Quackenbush. Now, nearly 75% of the money spent in the crucial final month of the election came from the insurance industry, largely in the form of TV attack ads against the pro-consumer candidate. Okay. And this is vitally important. Quackenbush is behind in this campaign to be elected insurance commissioner until these TV attack ads come. He's behind by double digits before the attack ads. Once the attack ads hit, he's ahead for good. And once elected, Quackenbush, among other things, actually tightened the tether of rates to where one lived rather than how an individual drove. And he did so by allowing geographical factors like an area's average wage and income levels to be computed in insurance premiums. Campaign finance reformers would later come to describe Quackenbush as, quote, Exhibit A in the public case to show how money's influence shaped policies and vitiated or tainted otherwise upstanding politicians. The Economist summed the relationship between the regulated insurance industry as, quote, incestuous, adding surely it's a little absurd to allow insurance commissioners to raise money from those they regulate. And Quackenbush is a sort of Willie Stark sort of figure. Maybe I'll sort of talk about it more in the Q&A session. And it shows the impact of the system on even, again, good individuals, I think, like Quackenbush. Now, insurers also dismiss those advocating reform to the territorial rating system as social engineering elites, even though Proposition 103 was, again, a popular initiative, which arose from, again, a populist movement. Yet fears of consumer revolts and government intervention did help to stabilize rates in California, as insurers offered one-time rate rebates and rollbacks. As a result, for instance, California saw its auto rates decline by 7% in the 1990s and early 2000s. Yet rate price remained unmoored from merit. Consequently, the ongoing subsidy persisted. And let me briefly explain this, what I mean and what it looks like. So the zip code rate calculus, again, would exact the financial cost well into the millions for urban and working class motorists, particularly among the segment of Californians assumed least in a position to possess either savings or investments. What I mean, for example, in the South Los Angeles district of Crenshaw, drivers spent $1,600 or more each year from those simply living across the street because they were labeled in the tonier sections, the Ladera Heights. Elsewhere in Los Angeles, another major insurer hiked premiums $1,400 when a good driver moved from zip code 90045 to zip code 90044. In Oakland, a similar disparity exists between upscale Montclair and Fruitvale. And gender and geography also made a material difference in how much a motorist paid. Now, insurers would argue that women paid less than men. But that assertion overlooks two important factors. First, it overlooked the feminization of poverty and the fact that women were more likely to live in poor or working in lower income neighborhoods. For example, a female 22 years old possessing a perfect driving record, that is, no accidents and no tickets, taking her 1996 Acura primarily to go to work, paid anywhere between $150 to $700 more if she lived in a poor community than a woman with the same driving profile who lived in a place like Huntington Beach. Second, to argue that women paid less also ignored that women drove fewer miles than men, and so per mile, women actually paid more. For reasons like these, groups like the National Organization of Women and League of Women Voters saw the continuation of gender-based pricing to be an insurance shell game, a hidden tax in which women had their rates lowered in one category of insurance, only to pay a much steeper rate in another. So they urged gender-neutral laws be applied not just in auto rating, but throughout the entire insurance pricing process, where classifications based on sex continue in places like pensions and annuities and in healthcare. Overcharges low-mileage drivers and penalizes women in areas of pensions, annuities, and healthcare costs. Now, and League of Women Voters concluded that insurers preferred identity over merit because they deemed it more profitable. Consequently, billions might be lost if the insurance business ended gender categorization in insurance. And by the early 2000s, there seemed little public will to reform the rating system. And this for three basic reasons. One, the insured saw modest relief, rate cuts and rebates. Secondly, insurers' success in winning the rhetorical debate. The efforts to regulate were part of a larger aim of social engineering by elites, eager to transfer and redistribute wealth to the undeserving. And making this argument, even though the 103 was a popular initiative. And third, I'd sort of harken back to the sort of Civil War arguments of people like James McPherson and the loss of public will in response to sustained industry pushback. Again, insurers kept these issues tied up in courts for years, and you can see the loss of the erosion of public support and the loss of public will. As of today, April 2010, auto insurance continues to be pegged primarily to where one lives rather than how one drives in every state but California. In the last 12 months, California is actually the only state in the union to change that policy. Prop 103 helps to inform us why factors beyond mere income explain the widening wealth differential in the U.S. over the last quarter century. The story of Proposition 103 and the failed efforts to enforce these postal code reforms may suggest something beyond how wealth is perpetuated in contemporary America. It may well suggest that the free market system's present-day biases, and by this I mean the immediate benefit insurers might gain by calculating in social factors and identity, may serve to countermand the nation's long-term commitment to individual merit. Now, in these four areas discussed above, home, school, work, and transportation, we see the rise of consumer finance fees during the golden age of deregulation. And these consumer finance fees have been a driver of economic stratification. Yet, there may be more than simply pecuniary considerations at issue. For the Defense Department, for instance, the impact of high-cost consumer fees is significant because active military duty families are most vulnerable. For the State Department, an economically segregated America may augur a new crisis of democracy, one echoing the Cold War Jim Crow years, when a racially segregated society ought to provide a grist for societies of Soviet Union's propaganda mill. Today's image of high-cost finance fees in such areas as housing, education, and transportation help to counter the State Department's officials' current efforts to sell the narrative of American democracy abroad to adherents of Islam, a religion that explicitly bans usury practices by Sharia law. Finally, this logic and argument has not been lost on Osama bin Laden, who in 2007, his first taped speech in nearly 3 years, specifically addressed, quote, the reeling of many of you in America on the burden of interest-related debts, insane taxes, and real estate mortgages. Similarly, in recent months, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the top lieutenant of Osama bin Laden, has also contrasted, this is again since the election of Obama, has also contrasted Islam with American capitalism in its embrace of, quote, the grand sin of usury. In these ways, my projects tackle the imagined and unintended policies that sustain and increase the wealth gap, what policymakers have done to aggravate and remedy this disparity, and what has proven to be the impact. But perhaps I'll let one of the greatest defenders and architects of deregulation have the final word, a man named Alan Greenspan, who shortly before he left as Fed chairman testified to Congress warning that America's ongoing economic stratification cannot, quote, said that ongoing economic stratification, quote, is not the type of thing that a capitalist democratic society can really accept without addressing. End quote. Thank you.
Thank you.
On the theme of the theme that emerged at the end of the talk, echoes of the Cold War and Jim Crow, I would, as I mentioned, like to turn first to Professor Jürgen Koka for a kind of German Tuvalu view of the way American society has changed in all these years, and then Carolyn Brown for a perspective. I guess it could only be called a Carolyn Brown perspective.
Thank you. If you could please wait for the microphone, which is coming right here.
And would people please identify themselves?
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's very kind of you to come back to my story about the mid-1960s when I did work as in a master's program in the University of North Carolina. And then in 1965 had the opportunity to teach German in summer school at Tougaloo College near Jackson, Mississippi, due to a constellation which I will not now reconstruct in detail, but there was a great man, Ernst Borinsky, who was a refugee from Germany, formerly a lawyer, Jewish, social democrat who was in the United States, retrained by the Quakers as a sociologist and then sent to the South to help to build up a sociology department in Tougaloo College, Mississippi. And he also thought that I, as a student, might be helpful in teaching a German class for 3 months in the summer. And so this was a great opportunity for me and really helped to form my image of the United States ever since. This was very important for me, but I find it tremendously difficult to relate this experience to your very interesting talk, except perhaps on a very general level, and this will then be my question to you. At that time, many things could be said about these 3 months in Tougaloo. This was the year just after the violent 1964 summer. Many liberal students from the North came down and tried to organize Afro-Americans, may not have been called this way that time, for voting. And but certainly from all the talks, I think basically there was a belief in the principal value of a merit-based society then. And the problems you mentioned, from what I remember, from what we talked about, were not in the center of our discussions. But it was the hope that once you removed certain obstacles of racial discrimination and certainly segregation at that time, once you would remove them, then the mechanisms of a liberal society would be able to pay out also for the blacks. And there was also a great hope that organizing for vote would change. And there were many examples. People would get a scholarship up north somewhere, and this was taken as a token for the real substance of these hopes. And for, as you mentioned, the importance as to abroad, I mean, these experiences were very important for the formation of the image of the United States in my part of the world, which is Germany, Europe. So my question, and I mean, I think my question would be, I mean, in contrast to this mood, the mood of your talk was different. It was a mood of being a bit disappointed about what has happened. That in contrast to intentions, the non-intentional consequences of what happened have eroded hopes and opportunities, and a certain disenchantment was part of the talk as I understood it. So my question is twofold. First, would your talk change if you took a longer time perspective, if you looked on the whole period from the 1960s to nowadays, would you then have two stories, one until the 70s, 80s, and then from the 80s to nowadays? How do you make this? How do you, as a historian who is interested in long-term change, how would you rephrase your thesis, perhaps? And secondly, what is specific? Do you think you told a specifically American story? I mean, deregulation, of course, is a transnational phenomenon, and it may not have happened, even started here, but perhaps in the United Kingdom under Thatcher. I mean, anyway, you can debate that. What do you see specifically American in the story you told?
Sure. To answer your first question, if I took a longer sort of historical perspective, how would the story change? I think you're largely correct. But I wouldn't just actually start in the 60s. I would actually go back to the New Deal era, circa 33, in where you see the role of the state as broker on behalf of consumers and other marginalized populations against very sort of aggregated interests. And so I would actually sort of date that narrative back to 1933. Look at the GI Bill, for instance. I mean, the GI Bill is the argument about the GI Bill. It was the first student aid bill, and was largely a sort of recognition, obviously, for the soldiers who risked their lives in World War II. But I mean, a secondary interest in the design of the GI Bill was also it was a concern about unemployment rates and how these returning soldiers again might vie for people with employment, and so the GI also then channeled people to school and college. So again, so they wouldn't necessarily again vie for employment, and so it was also a way in which to defray employment for millions of Americans coming back from war, and so I would sort of date the narrative back to the 1930s, actually, to the New Deal period. I think that would in part be a more effective, because in part the 60s was a culmination of New Deal politics and liberalism, which started out in the 1930s. So I would in part sort of date it there. Now the question is this a uniquely American story? Absolutely not. There's an organization in Europe called Debt on Our Doorstep, and it's an organization which popped up in response to the increased amount of debt that European consumers were experiencing. And so in one way I go about my research project is I find out where the institutional responses, what institutions pop up. And institutions usually respond to a crisis, a situation, or a condition. And so we get to see the sort of rise of consumer advocacy groups in Europe in the last 10 years or so in response to deregulatory policies and increased debt of consumers. And so, no, it's not a uniquely American story at all, I'd say.
The director of the Kluge Center, and then open discussion.
Well, Roger, I'm glad you said perspective, because my perspective is I think rather different. I come from, and I need to say something personal, from a background where in high school I concluded that most of what I was being told by history was lies, and therefore I abandoned American history as a pack of lies, because I knew enough about African American history to know I wasn't getting told the truth, and went off and studied China. So the premise that I grew up with, and I would say also in my family, because my father was a Cornell graduate who got an MBA in 1929, was to assume that as your starting premise that what you're told is not what's true. And when you start with that premise, you may be really happily surprised, but and you still may get fooled, but it's a different worldview to begin with. And I have found it quite amazing that people so easily believe what they're told, when it should be apparent that the structures that help get you into the situation you're in, the people who ran those structures are not the ones who are going to help get you out. So that's so I would say that it's the notion that the U.S. is a merit-based society, or even aspires to be one, is in conflict with the other narrative of or other narratives of American history that have to do with race and privilege and keeping power and keeping money, which I don't think is actually that different from other parts of the world. What's different is the two narratives, which then become, I think, more complicated because of our notion of the individual as having so much power without a complementary notion of the impact of the community and the systems that we're in. I guess I won't keep going on, but it's a different kind of perspective. I think that you're tracking how legislation and policies that had one stated objective turn out to have different stated objectives is really useful and valuable work. But I'm not sure in many cases that the stated objective was ever the real objective to begin with. So you've got to look at the multiplicity. And finally, I would say, and this almost comes out of almost a sort of Buddhist perspective, or at least I've heard it articulated well from a Buddhist perspective, that your enemies, rightly understood, can be your great friends, because they will look at the vulnerabilities that you have, and if they're generous enough to point them out instead of simply using them, you have a great learning opportunity. And we saw this in the Jim Crow era when American policymakers were very concerned about the image that the U.S. was projecting for, then I guess we were Negroes then, for Negroes, and then black people would dress up as Africans and go south to be treated differently. But that was the concern then, and the country felt it needed to hide that or somehow come to terms with it. Similarly, if we would take then seriously the accusation that we practice usury in ways that are inappropriate and Sharia law is better, of course it's very nice that that's the aspect of Sharia law that was selected. So, you know, we all know about those lies, we're used to those. But it is an opportunity for us to think about ourselves and to think what democracy means when you don't really have a kind of economic basis. So we were running around the world trying to promote democracy, even in a very narrow sense of institutions, without thinking about the tensions in democratic institutions and economic institutions and how those work together. So it's just a story about giving both sides at the same time and looking at the tensions, and they fall differently at different times in different places.
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you. Devin, would you like to respond?
No, absolutely. This is, again, very similar to the Cold War period when there are sort of two competing narratives. And so very similar to that period. Regarding my, I don't know. I might be slightly more optimistic to you about the narrative of America at some level. I go back to the sort of Weberian argument that laws, in part, are the expression of a society's vision for what it wants to be and what it aspires to be, and and that sort of, and even if it again, it's almost like a Catholicism, which actually might not be a good thing to bring up. That perfection is never achieved, but is always strived toward at some level. So this argument about being a merit-based society is something that at least is codified in law, and there's something in which we could sort of hold and see if people sort of reify what's actually being expressed. And I think there's value in that. I think there's value in an expression of equality, an expression of merit. And again, and the merit argument is obviously one in which I try to sort of explore and interrogate, because if one wants merit in one aspect of society, then let's have it in all aspects, and that sort of a consistent intellectual consistency in that sort of sense. But yeah, again, I go back to the argument that laws are basically an expression of a society's vision and ideal of itself, and that's a bit more sanguine, I think. Yes.
Thank you. We have lots of talent around the table, lots of other talent around the table. Roger and I, as always, like to bring this to conclusion just right at 5:30. So we have a few minutes left. So if you could please wait for the microphone, and Flip, please introduce yourself.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Devin, thanks so much. Two things. One is to push the historical analogy a little bit. I wonder whether you couldn't make the analogy to the Gilded Age rather than to the 1960s civil rights era, et cetera, where you have government regulation that permits misuse of, I see you're nodding, Roger, that permits injustice. I think that's a strong word, but I think it's an appropriate word, by private regulators, private insurers, private enterprisers. And I think really the analogy is there. And if you accept that analogy, then this becomes a constant, or more of a constant, running throughout American history rather than something that is very specific to a period. The other thing is I wonder about the analogy of race, Cold War, international relations, and usury, Muslim world now. Never mind what Osama said. I mean, when he said he can say whatever he wants to say, obviously. But if you look at what actually happens in many of the Muslim countries in the world, particularly in the area that he comes from, usury, or the laws against usury, are gotten around, and it's popularly understood that they're gotten around by all kinds of devices, such as instead of you getting a mortgage on your home, the bank buys the home and lends it to you, and then you pay back over a series of years, but you're not paying interest.
Sure.
And I don't know that the argument about usury in the United States would resound in the Arab street the way the argument about race certainly did resound around the world during the pre-Civil War, the Civil Rights, era and after that. So I'm not sure that analogy works entirely well.
Okay.
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Or one could look back through Cold War and communism, where various activists said that the argument that communism is colorblind is a canard, and so again, what you're saying about the contradictions of critics of America in terms of arguments about Sharia law and usury, absolutely right. But again, by the same token, they were during the Cold War period, the Civil Rights period. A number of critics across in part of the ideological spectrum. You talk about integrationists as well as black nationalists, who argue that communism was far from colorblind, and that Americans were simply a dupe. Think about someone like Harold Cruz, Crisis of Negro Intellectual, in '67, writes this in part a screed, but in part, I mean, some fantastic insights dating how communism since the 19-teens and 1920s had sort of manipulated Black Americans. And so that argument, I hear what you're saying, but there are also arguments that actually could be made about the fallacies of communism being colorblind since the 19-teens, 20s through the Civil Rights period.
Shel?
Yeah. Hi, Shel Garin. I'm a fellow here at the Center. Devin, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to start out with a comment and then a question. The comment is about the Sharia and Osama bin Laden. I think in some ways you can broaden that out because actually if you ask most people in the world about American excessive consumption and debt, almost everybody goes ballistic in the same way. So it's not just the Islamic world. Japanese and then Chinese have been lecturing. Europeans have been lecturing the United States about its unsustainable consumption and credit and exploitation, predatory lending, etc. So I think you're right in saying it possibly diminishes us, but I would say it goes well beyond the Islamic. But my question is, you presented us a very complex analysis on how these sad stories unfolded. And you tend to emphasize, I guess, what historians would call contingency, unintended consequences. I think that's admirable of you. Most people in the country wouldn't do that. They would actually have villains. And I'm not sure that's a bad way of going about it. And if you ask progressives, they would say it's rapacious institutions with enormous political clout. And if you ask the right, like Alan Greenspan, he would say Acorn. He would say fuzzy Democrats and people who believed in extending subprime loans to everybody who couldn't pay, and HUD and liberal congressmen, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about the question of how you would distill, again, to somebody who wasn't from the United States, how all these things unfolded, would you just stay with the unintended consequences and the sort of the vague, sort of passive way things unfolded? Or are there clear institutions and forces you could identify?
No, there are absolutely there are clear institutions and forces. Obviously, regulators. That old argument, but again, that too is a layered argument. I didn't go through it here, but the payday loan issue in 2000, the Office of Comptroller of Currency is of its OCC is again sends out this memo which says these third-party arrangements. These third-party arrangements are basically payday lenders who connect with banks in order for payday lenders to have more access to capital, and also in part to get around state laws. But these payday lenders who connect with banks are actually threatening and undermining the safety and soundness of these financial institutions, of actual banks, right? This is in 2000. So the questions about safety and soundness, and if everyone knows how I mean, the objective, the business aim and objective of a payday lending company, it's again that in part that the borrower really doesn't pay off the loan, right? Is that you flip the loan, right? And so the aim and objective is not for the borrower to necessarily pay off the loan. That's the focus, but to have that borrower come back in to flip the loan so they increasingly become more in debt and greatly in debt, which is in part the exact opposite and function of an actual depository institution, i.e. a bank. Right, a bank wants people who can actually pay off their loan, and so in part these two institutions are working across purposes, and so regulators can send this memo out, urging that banks stop this, and this happens in 2000, and in part what happens is there's a change of the White House, and there's nothing done about, again, this great concern about the third-party arrangements, or what they call rent-a-bank arrangements between banks and payday lenders. And part of this project actually got started when I was finishing my first book and starting on the second. And I have a lot of friends who are financial regulators from the New York area, a lot of friends financial regulators. And so I had the chance to travel around the country to some of the conferences, these regulators. And regularly, they would tell me horror stories in the ways in which they wanted to regulate the banks in which they were investigating. But the problem was the political appointed regulators. So there's a gap between the grassroots regulators, i.e. the regulators who goes to Banco Popular, the regulator who goes to Chase Bank, the regulator who goes to the bank on the corner, local bank, community bank, and the political appointed regulator who gets appointed by an administration. And this really does echo civil rights period. There's a wonderful book called Free at Last to Vote, written by a Department of Justice attorney, Brian Landsberg, who is now a law professor in San Francisco. And Landsberg was a DOJ attorney in the 1950s. And in that book, he talks about the change of political will when administrations change, and how he got a lot of political wind at his back, policy wind at his back, to enforce civil rights policy under the Kennedy administration that he didn't get necessarily under in the Eisenhower years. Again, this is a regulator, a Department of Justice attorney on the ground in the 1950s, early 60s, talking about the value of grass top regulators who are willing to enforce policy. Same sort of thing here. The grassroots regulators, the people who go into the banks regularly, investigate these banks, people who are telling me these horror stories early in the decade, but without the political will of the grass top regulators. And so you have the grass top regulators versus grassroots regulators, which is, again, this is language that part comes from the civil rights activists in the 1960s, grassroots versus grass tops. And so there's not the social will, the political will from grass top regulators who are largely politically appointed officials. And so there, I would say, lies largely the problem, the grass top regulators, because the grassroots regulators are the careerists, again, who go into the field and who share all these horror stories, and who encourage me to read Noam Chomsky. I mean, not the ones who are reading
Devin,
Milton Friedman.
We have so many people that have so much to say and so many questions. Would you mind if we collect the questions and then let you respond?
Sure.
Ross?
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Listening to your analysis, let me suggest there's some background or some other factors behind that the trends you've described exacerbate, but build on some of those. The home, subprime and all that. Okay. Based on this, this prior promotion of home ownership as kind of an American value, and that goes to the mortgage deduction and income tax above a certain level, and the back to the GI Bill and all related to the GI Bill and all that, which I think is fairly unique to this country. And if you hadn't had that sort of promotion of home ownership as sort of the prime American social value, would we have had what you describe, in at least to the extent we've had? And the other is just a question I keep asking myself, and clearly it's subject to analysis, and I just haven't seen it yet. The student loan problem, burden, overhang. I mean, part of it is the cost of education, which, as you say, has gone up so much more than the cost of living over the years, and seems to be a lot more than comparatively elsewhere in the world. How do we explain that? We asked the same question about medical costs. Perhaps you saw this story the other day that for the Australian ambassador's accident and repair here, it cost 4 times as much in the United States as it would have cost in Australia. How do we explain this sort of cost burden that then these factors that you've been talking about, if we didn't have those, wouldn't that mitigate some of the problems you're talking about?
Thank you. Hold on. Any other questions? Yep.
Okay, I kind of have a big question. I'm thinking about how what your research says might fit into this larger idea of how Americans conceive of equality and specifically equal rights. And what I'm thinking about is the American constitutional tradition of negative rights, in that we don't have the positive right to free speech, but we have the negative right that Congress shall make no law. Sure. And then same thing with the equal rights protection in the Constitution. It's equality under the law shall not be infringed upon. So I just wonder, thinking about that, if maybe one of the problems here is that the way that Americans conceive of equality is that there should not be inequality. And I just wondered kind of your opinion on that, if you thought about that, and if maybe that hands-off way of thinking about equality plays into what you're talking about.
Thank you. Big questions are always good. Though we're running out of time, we'll go over here. Right behind you.
I know you've mainly...
Please state your name.
David Nichols at the State Department. I know you've mainly focused on the 20th century, but I was curious if you think it might be how you see this fitting into a broader story about Americans' attitudes towards debt. Historians who've looked at the American Revolution, some of the later periods, have talked about a small r republicanism, which has very specific ideas about some Americans having been very concerned about debt and about consumption and corruption, and that having been a factor that has led to social movements, perhaps including the American Revolution at various times. And do you think that Americans have become more tolerant towards debt over time? Or I was curious how you see the broader framework of this in American history.
Okay, and final question.
Oh, hi, I'm Jill Shankelman from the Centre here. One comment. Fantastic, really interesting talk. I think linking together apparently extremely tedious commercial regulatory things with impacts on real people is really important and great to hear. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think about deregulation, because particularly the insurance story, it strikes me that that's actually a very controlled deregulated market, because the idea that there are people in bad postcodes with great driving records who are paying these exorbitant insurance costs means that would be a fabulous market opportunity for a company to go in and cream off that. So there's something that's stopping that happening. So there's something quite complicated in the deregulation.
Thank you. 4 big questions and 3 minutes left.
So I'll hold off for 90 seconds. So just wait. The cost of higher education. There are sundry factors involved in the cost of higher education, but I think perhaps the big one, and the ones which I think experts have sort of talked about most, is the rollback of federal and state financial support. And I didn't talk about it here, but again, this is a part where it happens. How do you, what's the ways in which colleges compensate for the loss of funding, federal funding, and state funding as well, is they cut back on capital costs, and they raise tuition and hike fees. Right? Again, California is a great example of this. And so the rise of higher education costs is directly related to the cutbacks and drawbacks of the federal and state governments in terms of financing higher education. And there's an excellent essay written on this subject matter by this scholar named Spencer. And so I would say that's largely the primary factor, the cost cutting at the federal and the state levels. That helps explain largely. Regarding negative and positive liberties, that is a sort of big question, and at some level it's more relevant to my first project than this one. It makes you think more of the first project than this one. I will in part say this, that Well, I mean, when I teach class, sometimes I do a sort of a Rawlsian experiment. We talk about negative and positive liberties, right? And when the first day of class, I come in and ask my students, I'm thinking about actually curbing the grades this semester. And so what do you guys think about that? Now, no one has taken an exam. They've barely gotten a hold of the syllabus. And everyone wants a social safety net. I'm the state, right? I'm the Leviathan. I'm the big government state beast. But everyone wants a social safety net. So virtually everyone calls for a positive liberty, i.e., they want me to curb the grade so they might do better, come GPA time, right? And I explained to them what might be the possible pitfalls of that. Well, when I write a letter of recommendation for you, I'll have to sort of include that part that I've actually curbed the grade, so the grade is not is sort of inflated, right? But everyone wants a social safety net, right? And this is a sort of Rawls talks about this experiment, right? And so I'm not sure if I'm so certain that Americans sort of embrace negative liberties, because when I do my own little mini experiments to my Vanderbilt students, right? And again, they're the children, ostensibly, of right, some of the elites. They call for welfare from the state, which is me. So I'm not quite sure if I'm sold on that argument. The third thing, in terms of republicanism, of small r, when I think of republicanism, I think of historians love to talk about change over time. I think of the change over time, the meaning of virtue. And Bill Bennett, of course, is the education secretary, which sort of ties into this, right? During this period of time, he comes in the mid 1980s, and the change in notion of what it means to be a virtuous society, and how virtue doesn't mean the things that we associate or tether with virtue today, i.e., whether someone whether someone behaves in, explicitly immoral ways, right? Well, the Bill Clinton side of critique of virtue, right? Or people critique Bill Clinton and that kind of virtue. But virtue is in part thinking about something bigger and larger than yourself, right? And this is in part what behavior economists and finance scholars in part get it with present bias. With present preference bias, right? Or present bias preference. Sorry, present bias preference. In that in theory, Americans think about something bigger and larger than themselves, but yet when they can get something out of self-interest, they will pursue that first, actually. And then last, in terms of deregulation and the ways in which this could corner the market, the argument is absolutely is correct. This is what reverse redlining is. Redlining was the exclusion of people from goods and services. Reverse redlining is we'll include you in goods and services, but at a premium, at a cost. So the idea of a cornered market, of a captive market, and this is a part why insurance regulators were reluctant to change the territorial rating system. They had a captive market. They took advantage of it, and then this idea of regulatory capture again, which is vitally important, especially as we perhaps move forward with health insurance. How do we have regulators who are not held captive by industry? It's a vital question, central question. Since there is no public option, I think that's in part is the next question related to campaign finance reform, frankly, because these things are tied together.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for Devin Fergus.